On the morning of May 18, 1927, the children of Bath Township, Michigan were counting down the final hours of their school year. The three-story Bath Consolidated School buzzed with the restless energy of 314 students eager for summer vacation to begin. Parents had already begun making plans for the months ahead. Farmers were preparing for the busy season, and teachers were looking forward to a well-deserved break from their lessons. But at precisely 8:45 a.m., their world would be shattered forever. A massive explosion tore through the north wing of the school building, so powerful that witnesses reported hearing it from several miles away. The roof collapsed instantly, burying dozens of children and teachers beneath tons of concrete, wood, and steel. As dust and debris filled the air, the screams of the injured mixed with the frantic cries of those searching desperately for survivors. What happened that morning in Bath Township would become known as the deadliest school massacre in American history. But unlike the random acts of violence we've become tragically familiar with today, this was something far more calculated, far more sinister, and far more methodically planned than anyone could have imagined. The man responsible had spent nearly a year preparing for this moment. He had carefully wired hundreds of pounds of military-grade explosives throughout the school building, timing his attack for maximum devastation. He had murdered his own wife just days before, destroyed his farm, and killed his livestock to ensure nothing would remain of his former life. And when first responders arrived at the scene to help the wounded, he wasn't finished. This is the story of Andrew Kehoe and the Bath School Massacre, a tragedy that would claim 45 lives and traumatize an entire community. It's a story about how one man's rage against his neighbors transformed into an unthinkable act of vengeance against the most innocent members of society. It's about how a respected member of the community, someone trusted with the care of the very building he would destroy, could harbor such darkness that he would attempt to murder an entire generation of children. The Bath School Massacre represents something unique in the annals of American crime. This wasn't a moment of passion or a sudden break from reality. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror that took months to plan and execute. The perpetrator wasn't a stranger or an outsider, but someone the community knew well, someone they had elected to positions of trust and responsibility. Understanding what happened in Bath Township requires us to examine not just the events of that terrible morning, but the months and years that led up to it. We need to understand who Andrew Kehoe was, what drove him to such extremes, and how he managed to carry out his plan without detection. We need to look at the warning signs that were missed, the opportunities for intervention that were overlooked, and the aftermath that forever changed how Americans think about school safety. The story begins not with the explosion itself, but with the man who caused it. Andrew Philip Kehoe was born in 1872 in Tecumseh, Michigan, the son of a successful farmer and businessman. By all accounts, he appeared to be a model citizen in his adult years. He was intelligent, well-educated, and skilled in multiple trades, including farming, electrical work, and mechanics. He owned a substantial farm on the outskirts of Bath Township, was married to a well-regarded local woman named Nellie Price, and had established himself as an active and engaged member of his community. Kehoe's involvement with the Bath Consolidated School began in 1924 when he was elected to the school board. The position came with significant responsibilities, as the board was overseeing the construction and financing of the new school building that would serve 3 local townships. The project was ambitious for such a rural area, requiring substantial tax increases to fund the modern facility that would replace the smaller, older schools scattered throughout the region. From the beginning, Kehoe was vocal about his opposition to the costs associated with the new school. Unlike many of his neighbors who had children attending the school, Kehoe and his wife were childless, and he saw no reason why he should bear the financial burden of educating other people's children. His complaints about the school taxes became increasingly frequent and bitter as the project progressed. Those who served alongside Kehoe on the school board later recalled that his demeanor began to change noticeably around 1925. Where he had once been merely vocal about his concerns, he became hostile and aggressive during meetings. He would rant about the unfairness of the tax system, the waste of money on unnecessary luxuries for the school, and what he perceived as the community's disregard for his financial situation. The truth was that Kehoe was facing serious financial difficulties. His farm was heavily mortgaged, and he was struggling to make payments on the debt he had accumulated to purchase and improve the property. The additional tax burden for the school only made his situation worse, and by 1926, he was facing the very real possibility of foreclosure. But Kehoe's problems went deeper than mere financial stress. Neighbors and acquaintances began to notice disturbing changes in his behavior and personality. He became increasingly isolated, spending long hours alone on his property. When he did interact with others, he was often argumentative and paranoid, convinced that his neighbors were conspiring against him. There were also troubling incidents that suggested a capacity for violence that had previously been hidden or controlled. He was known to have killed a neighbor's dog that had wandered onto his property, beating the animal to death with a club. He had also reportedly beaten one of his own horses to death in a fit of rage, an act that shocked even his rural neighbors who were accustomed to the sometimes harsh realities of farm life. Despite these warning signs, Kehoe maintained enough of his public facade to avoid serious scrutiny. He continued to attend school board meetings, though his contributions became increasingly disruptive. He still performed electrical work for various clients in the community, including the school itself. And he remained married to Nellie, though those close to the couple noted that their relationship had become strained and distant. The final transformation of Andrew Kehoe from a troubled community member into a mass murderer appears to have begun in earnest during the spring of 1926. It was around this time that he began purchasing large quantities of explosives, ostensibly for use in clearing tree stumps and other farm work. Because such purchases were not unusual for farmers in the area, and because Kehoe spread his buying among several different suppliers, his activities didn't raise immediate suspicion. What no one realized was that Kehoe had already begun planning his attack on the school. He had access to the building through his position on the school board and his work as an electrician performing maintenance on the facility's electrical systems. During the summer and fall of 1926, he made numerous trips to the school, often working alone in the basement and other areas of the building. Neighbors occasionally noticed Kehoe at the school during odd hours, carrying boxes and equipment into the building. When questioned, he explained that he was working on electrical repairs or improvements, a reasonable explanation given his known expertise and his official connection to the school. No one suspected that he was actually installing a sophisticated network of explosives throughout the structure. The scale of Kehoe's preparations was truly staggering. Over the course of several months, he managed to place approximately 1,000 pounds of dynamite and pyrotol throughout the school building. The explosives were carefully positioned to cause maximum structural damage, with particular attention paid to the supports that held up the floors and roof. He also installed a complex system of wiring that would allow him to detonate the charges remotely. But the school wasn't Kehoe's only target. As his plans developed, they expanded to include his own property and family. He began systematically destroying his farm, cutting down fruit trees, killing livestock, and damaging equipment and buildings. He also started making preparations to murder his wife, though the exact timeline of when he decided to kill Nellie remains unclear. The psychological deterioration that drove Kehoe to these extremes is difficult to fully understand, even with the benefit of modern knowledge about mental health and criminal behavior. Some experts have suggested that he suffered from paranoid personality disorder, which would explain his increasing suspicion of his neighbors and his belief that he was being persecuted by the community. Others have pointed to possible psychopathic traits, including his apparent lack of empathy for his intended victims and his ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while planning mass murder. What is clear is that by early 1927, Kehoe had moved beyond mere resentment about his financial problems and had developed a comprehensive plan for revenge against the entire community. He saw the school not just as a symbol of the tax burden that was crushing him financially, but as the heart of a community that he believed had rejected and betrayed him. The final weeks before the attack saw an acceleration in Kehoe's preparations. He continued to refine his explosive devices, tested his detonation systems, and made final arrangements for the destruction of his property. He also began making arrangements that suggest he knew his actions would result in his own death, settling debts and putting his affairs in order as much as his financial situation allowed. On May 16, 1927, Nellie Kehoe returned home from the hospital where she had been receiving treatment for tuberculosis. Her homecoming should have been a happy occasion, but instead, it marked the beginning of the final phase of her husband's murderous plan. Sometime between her return and the morning of May 18th, Andrew Kehoe killed his wife, likely by bludgeoning her to death, though the exact method was never definitively determined due to the condition of her body when it was discovered. With his wife dead and his preparations complete, Kehoe spent the early morning hours of May 18th making his final preparations. He set fires throughout his farm buildings, ensuring that his property would be destroyed along with any evidence of his planning. He loaded his truck with additional explosives and shrapnel, creating a mobile bomb that he would use in the final phase of his attack. At Bath Consolidated School, the morning began like any other. Teachers were conducting their final lessons of the school year. Students were eagerly anticipating the start of summer vacation, and parents were making plans for the months ahead. No one had any indication that they were living through the final moments of normalcy their community would know for a long time. The first explosion occurred at exactly 8:45 a.m., devastating the north wing of the school building. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the entire structure off its foundation before the walls collapsed inward, trapping dozens of children and teachers beneath the rubble. The sound of the explosion was heard for miles around, and within minutes, people began arriving from throughout the township to help with rescue efforts. What they found was a scene of unimaginable horror. The north wing of the school had been completely destroyed, with massive concrete slabs and wooden beams crushing the classrooms below. Dust and smoke filled the air, making it difficult to see or breathe. The screams and cries of the injured mixed with the frantic shouts of rescuers trying to coordinate their efforts. Among those who arrived at the scene was Andrew Kehoe himself, driving his explosives-laden truck. To the people gathered there, his presence seemed natural, even admirable. As a member of the school board, it made sense that he would want to help with the rescue efforts. No one suspected that he was actually the person responsible for the devastation they were witnessing. Kehoe parked his truck near the area where rescue workers and officials had gathered, including school superintendent Emery Hewick. Witnesses later reported seeing Kehoe approach Hewick and engage him in what appeared to be a conversation. Some thought they saw the two men struggling with what might have been a rifle or shotgun, though the chaos of the scene made it difficult to be certain about what was happening. What happened next would sear itself into the memories of everyone present. At approximately 9:45 a.m., exactly 1 hour after the first explosion, Kehoe detonated the explosives in his truck. The blast killed him instantly, along with Superintendent Hewick and several other people who had been standing nearby. Among the victims of this second explosion was 8-year-old Cleo Clayton, who had survived the collapse of the school building only to be killed by shrapnel from Kehoe's truck bomb. The truck explosion not only added to the death toll but also eliminated any possibility of learning more about Kehoe's motivations directly from him. With the perpetrator dead, investigators would have to piece together his story from the evidence he left behind and the testimony of those who had known him. The immediate aftermath of the explosions was marked by a heroic response from the Bath Township community and surrounding areas. Despite the shock and horror of what had happened, people worked tirelessly to rescue survivors from the rubble of the school building. Farmers brought equipment to help lift heavy debris. Medical personnel arrived from nearby cities to treat the injured, and volunteers provided food, shelter, and comfort to the families affected by the tragedy. The rescue efforts continued for hours, with workers carefully removing debris piece by piece to avoid causing further injury to anyone who might still be alive beneath the rubble. In some cases, they were successful, pulling injured but living children and adults from the wreckage. But in too many instances, they found only bodies, often so badly crushed or burned that identification was difficult or impossible. As news of the disaster spread beyond Bath Township, reporters and officials began arriving from across Michigan and neighboring states. The scale of the tragedy, combined with the shocking revelation that it had been deliberately caused by a respected member of the community, made it one of the biggest news stories of the year. The investigation into the bombing began immediately, with local law enforcement working alongside state and federal authorities to determine the full extent of Kehoe's plan and whether he had received assistance from anyone else. The physical evidence found at the scene painted a terrifying picture of calculated malice. When investigators searched through the wreckage of the Bath Consolidated School, they discovered the full scope of Andrew Kehoe's methodical planning. The explosive devices had been strategically placed throughout the building's basement and support structures, with wiring so sophisticated that experts later marveled at the technical precision required for such devastation. What made the discovery even more chilling was the evidence of Kehoe's ongoing access to the building. As the school board treasurer and a trusted member of the community, he had possessed keys to the facility and had volunteered for maintenance work that gave him unlimited access during evening hours. Investigators found tool marks on basement walls where he had methodically carved out spaces to conceal the explosives, work that would have taken months to complete without detection. The dynamite itself told a story of premeditation that stretched back nearly a year. Kehoe had purchased the materials from multiple suppliers across several counties, carefully spacing out his acquisitions to avoid suspicion. Some of the explosives were military surplus he had legitimately obtained for his farm work, while others appeared to have been stolen from construction sites in the region. The pyritol, a particularly devastating explosive made from reprocessed military ordnance, had been arranged in a pattern designed to bring down the entire north wing of the building in a cascading collapse. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of a timing mechanism that would have detonated the remaining unexploded charges. The device had malfunctioned, likely saving the lives of hundreds of additional children and teachers. Had it worked as intended, the entire three-story structure would have been reduced to rubble, potentially killing every soul inside. The basement also contained the gasoline-filled containers that served as Kehoe's backup plan, positioned to create a massive fireball that would have consumed any survivors of the initial blast. As rescue workers continued pulling victims from the wreckage throughout that horrific morning, the community's shock deepened with each revelation about the scope of Kehoe's preparations. The man they had trusted with their children's safety, who had sat in school board meetings debating budgets and educational policies, had been simultaneously plotting the annihilation of an entire generation. The psychological profile that emerged from witness accounts painted a picture of a man whose descent into murderous rage had been gradual but inexorable. Neighbors recalled how Kehoe's behavior had grown increasingly erratic following his electoral defeat for township clerk. What had once been occasional outbursts of temper became sustained periods of brooding resentment. He had stopped maintaining his farm, allowing crops to rot in the fields while he obsessed over what he perceived as the community's betrayal. His wife Nellie had become increasingly fearful of him during her final months. Hospital staff who had treated her for tuberculosis later recalled how she would flinch when Andrew visited, and how she had made cryptic comments about being afraid to go home. One nurse remembered Nellie saying that Andrew had changed, that there was something dark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The discovery of her body, positioned carefully beside their most valuable possessions, suggested that even her murder had been part of his methodical plan. The investigation into Kehoe's financial situation revealed another layer of his motivation. The tax burden for the new school had indeed created hardship for his farm, but investigators found that his financial troubles ran much deeper. He had made a series of poor investments and had borrowed heavily against his property. The school tax, while burdensome, was merely the final straw in a pattern of financial irresponsibility that he refused to acknowledge as his own fault. What truly distinguished Kehoe from other perpetrators of mass violence was the cold calculation behind his actions. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of psychological breakdown. Every aspect had been planned with meticulous attention to detail. He had studied the school's structure, learned the daily routines of students and teachers, and timed his attack for maximum impact. The fact that he chose the last day of the school year ensured that his victims would be in a celebratory mood, their guard completely down. The community's response in the immediate aftermath demonstrated both the best and worst of human nature. While volunteers poured in from across Michigan to help with rescue efforts and rebuilding, there were also disturbing undercurrents of suspicion and blame. Some residents questioned whether there had been warning signs that others had ignored. Others wondered if the school board had been negligent in allowing Kehoe such unrestricted access to the building. The medical response to the disaster revealed the limitations of rural health care in 1927. The nearest hospital was in Lansing, more than 10 miles away, and many of the most severely injured victims died during transport or while waiting for treatment. Local physicians, overwhelmed by the scope of the casualties, made desperate attempts to save lives with limited resources. The town's only undertaker was similarly overwhelmed, requiring assistance from funeral homes across the region to handle the unprecedented number of victims. The psychological trauma extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Teachers who survived struggled with guilt over their inability to protect their students. Parents who had sent their children to school that morning believing them to be safe found themselves grappling with a sense of vulnerability that would never fully heal. The entire community was forced to confront the reality that evil could emerge from within their own ranks, perpetrated by someone they had known and trusted. As news of the bombing spread beyond Bath Township, it captured national attention in ways that foreshadowed later school tragedies. Newspapers across the country ran detailed accounts of the massacre, often focusing on the most sensational aspects rather than the deeper questions about how such violence could be prevented. The coverage established patterns that would be repeated in later decades, with extensive speculation about the perpetrator's motives and mental state. The investigation continued for months after the bombing, as authorities sought to understand every aspect of Kehoe's planning and execution. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, analyzed every piece of physical evidence, and constructed detailed timelines of his activities. What emerged was a portrait of systematic preparation that had unfolded over nearly a year, hidden behind a facade of normal community involvement. The broader implications of the Bath School massacre extended beyond the immediate tragedy. It marked the first time that explosives had been used in a mass attack on an American school, establishing a horrific precedent that would unfortunately be followed by others in later decades. The incident also highlighted the vulnerability of educational institutions and the trust that communities place in those who serve in positions of authority over their children. Law enforcement agencies began developing new protocols for investigating threats against schools and recognizing warning signs of planned violence. The Bath case became a study in how seemingly rational individuals could harbor murderous intentions while maintaining outward appearances of normalcy. It challenged assumptions about the predictability of human behavior and the effectiveness of community oversight in preventing such tragedies. The rebuilding of the school became a symbol of the community's determination to overcome the horror that had been visited upon them. The new structure incorporated safety features that had been absent from the original building, and security procedures were implemented to prevent unauthorized access. However, these practical measures could not address the deeper psychological wounds that would take generations to heal. The legacy of Andrew Kehoe's actions extended far beyond the physical destruction he caused. His crime shattered the innocence of a small farming community and introduced a new form of terror to American society. Following the catastrophic events of May 18, 1927, the Bath community found itself grappling with an unprecedented tragedy that would forever alter the fabric of their small rural town. In the immediate aftermath of the explosions, as rescue workers continued pulling bodies from the rubble and investigators combed through the devastating evidence of Andrew Kehoe's carefully orchestrated plan, the true scope of what had nearly occurred began to emerge. The discovery of the additional 500 pounds of unexploded dynamite in the school's basement sent chills through everyone involved in the investigation. Had those explosives detonated as Kehoe intended, the death toll would have been catastrophically higher, potentially wiping out nearly every child in the Bath Township community. The investigation into Kehoe's methodical preparation revealed a level of premeditation that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. Evidence suggested that Kehoe had been planning this attack for nearly a year, systematically purchasing explosives from multiple suppliers to avoid suspicion, stealing additional dynamite from construction sites and using his position as school board treasurer and his expertise as an electrician to gain unrestricted access to the school building. Neighbors later recalled seeing Kehoe making frequent nighttime visits to the school, carrying heavy boxes and working inside the building during evening hours when no one else was present. His meticulous planning extended to creating backup detonation methods, including the gasoline-filled containers found in the basement, demonstrating that he was determined to ensure maximum destruction regardless of whether his primary explosive charges functioned properly. The community's response to the tragedy was immediate and overwhelming. Word of the Bath School disaster spread rapidly through telegraph lines and newspaper reports, drawing national attention to the small Michigan township. Within hours of the explosions, volunteers began arriving from neighboring communities, bringing medical supplies, food, and offers of assistance. The American Red Cross established an emergency relief station in Bath, coordinating rescue efforts and providing support to families who had lost children or were searching for missing loved ones. Local churches opened their doors as temporary shelters and gathering places for grieving families, while area hospitals mobilized all available medical personnel to treat the injured survivors. The investigation team, led by state police detectives and federal agents, worked tirelessly to piece together the timeline of Kehoe's plot. They discovered that his planning had begun in earnest following his defeat in the township clerk election in April 1926, an event that appeared to trigger his descent into vengeful obsession. Financial records revealed that Kehoe had been facing increasing debt and the potential foreclosure of his farm, pressures that likely contributed to his growing resentment toward the school tax that helped fund the Bath Consolidated School. However, investigators noted that many other farmers in the area faced similar financial hardships without resorting to mass violence, suggesting that Kehoe's motivations went beyond mere economic distress. The psychological profile that emerged from witness interviews painted a picture of a man whose personality had undergone a dramatic transformation in the months leading up to the attack. Neighbors described Kehoe as becoming increasingly isolated and paranoid, abandoning the maintenance of his farm and spending his time instead on what they now realized were preparations for his murderous plot. His wife Nellie's prolonged illness and hospitalization for tuberculosis had left him largely alone on the farm, providing him with the privacy he needed to stockpile explosives and plan his revenge. The discovery of her murdered body, carefully positioned near valuable items that Kehoe had apparently saved from the destruction of their home, suggested that even her death had been calculated as part of his final act of vengeance. The community struggled to comprehend how someone they had known and trusted could perpetrate such an unthinkable act of violence against innocent children. Kehoe had been a respected member of the school board, trusted with the institution's finances and maintenance needs. Parents had seen him at school functions and community meetings, never suspecting that he harbored such deadly intentions toward their children. This betrayal of trust added another layer of trauma to an already devastated community, forcing residents to question their assumptions about the people they thought they knew. The national media coverage of the Bath School disaster was extensive but relatively brief, as the story was quickly overshadowed by Charles Lindbergh's historic transatlantic flight just 2 days later. Nevertheless, the coverage that did occur helped establish the attack as a watershed moment in American history, marking the first time that a school had been deliberately targeted for mass destruction. Newspaper accounts from across the country expressed shock and bewilderment at the calculated nature of the attack, with many editorial writers struggling to find precedents for such an act of violence against children in a peaceful rural community. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound and long-lasting. Children who had been in the school during the explosion carried physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Many reported recurring nightmares, an inability to concentrate in enclosed spaces, and a persistent fear that similar attacks could happen again. Teachers who survived the blast faced the challenge of returning to their profession while dealing with their own trauma and the knowledge that their workplace had been deliberately targeted for destruction. The broader community experienced what would now be recognized as collective trauma, a shared psychological wound that affected everyone who lived through the disaster. In the weeks following the attack, support poured in from across the nation. Financial contributions arrived from individuals, organizations, and businesses wanting to help the Bath community rebuild and recover. The Ford Motor Company, based in nearby Detroit, made a substantial donation toward the construction of a new school building. Senator James Couzens, a former business partner of Henry Ford, personally contributed $75,000 to the rebuilding effort, a sum so significant that the new school was eventually named in his honor. These generous contributions demonstrated the nation's sympathy for the Bath community and its determination to help them overcome the tragedy. The rebuilding process itself became a symbol of resilience and community strength. Rather than allowing Kehoe's act of destruction to defeat them, the residents of Bath Township came together to create something better from the ashes of their loss. The new James Couzens Agricultural School was built with improved safety features and modern educational facilities, representing not just a replacement for what had been destroyed, but an advancement in the community's commitment to education. The construction project provided employment for local workers and served as a focal point for the community's healing process. However, the process of moving forward was complicated by the need to address the security vulnerabilities that had allowed Kehoe to carry out his attack. School officials across the country began implementing new security measures, including restrictions on after-hours access to school buildings and more careful screening of maintenance personnel and contractors. The Bath disaster served as a wake-up call for educational institutions nationwide, forcing them to consider threats they had never previously imagined. The legal and procedural changes that emerged from the Bath School investigation had lasting impacts on law enforcement practices. The multi-jurisdictional nature of the investigation, involving local police, state authorities, and federal agents, helped establish protocols for handling complex criminal cases that crossed traditional boundaries. The forensic analysis of the explosive devices and the painstaking reconstruction of Kehoe's planning process contributed to the development of investigative techniques that would prove valuable in future cases involving domestic terrorism and mass violence. The community's efforts to memorialize the victims and preserve the memory of the tragedy evolved over time. In the immediate aftermath, simple monuments were erected to honor those who had died, but as years passed, more permanent memorials were established. The Bath School Museum was eventually created to ensure that the story of the disaster would not be forgotten, housing artifacts, photographs, and personal accounts from survivors and their families. These memorial efforts reflected the community's determination to honor the memory of the victims, while also serving as a warning about the potential for such violence to occur again. The Bath School disaster also contributed to broader conversations about mental health and the warning signs of potential violence. While the debate over Kehoe's mental state continued long after his death, the case highlighted the importance of recognizing behavioral changes that might indicate someone was planning harmful actions. His increasing isolation, paranoid statements, and abandonment of normal activities were all signs that, in retrospect, might have alerted the community to potential danger. This recognition contributed to evolving understanding of threat assessment and the importance of taking seriously concerning behaviors in community members. The educational impact of the Bath School disaster extended far beyond the immediate community. The attack prompted discussions about school safety, emergency preparedness, and the vulnerability of educational institutions to deliberate violence. These conversations, while painful, helped lay the groundwork for future safety improvements and emergency response protocols that would become standard in American schools. The tragedy served as a stark reminder that schools, despite being places of learning and growth, were not immune to the potential for violence and required thoughtful planning to protect students and staff. As the Bath community continued its long process of healing and recovery, the resilience demonstrated by survivors and their families became a testament to the human capacity to overcome even the most devastating tragedies. The children who survived the explosion grew up to become productive members of society, many of them staying in the Bath area and contributing to their community's continued development. Their ability to move forward while carrying the memory of their lost classmates and teachers demonstrated the strength that can emerge from shared trauma when communities come together to support one another. The Bath School disaster remains a pivotal moment in American history, marking the beginning of a new awareness about the potential for mass violence in previously safe environments. While the specific circumstances that led to Andrew Kehoe's attack were unique to his situation and the Bath community, the broader lessons about the importance of threat recognition, community vigilance, and emergency preparedness have continued relevance. The immediate aftermath of the Bath School massacre sent shockwaves through the community and across the nation in ways that few could have anticipated. As the dust settled and the full scope of Andrew Kehoe's calculated destruction became clear, Bath Township found itself at the center of a tragedy that would fundamentally alter how Americans viewed school safety and the potential for violence in their most trusted institutions. In the hours following the explosions, Bath transformed from a quiet farming community into a scene of organized chaos. Emergency responders from across central Michigan converged on the township, bringing with them medical supplies, search equipment, and expertise that the small community desperately needed. Dr. A. Crum, the local physician who had been among the first to respond, found himself coordinating a makeshift field hospital as injured children and adults continued to arrive from the wreckage. The rescue efforts revealed the true extent of Kehoe's meticulous planning. Investigators discovered that the wiring for the explosives had been installed with professional precision throughout the school's basement and crawl spaces. The dynamite and pyritol had been positioned to maximize structural damage, with particular attention paid to the load-bearing elements that would cause the most catastrophic collapse. What made the discovery even more chilling was the realization that Kehoe had accessed these areas during his authorized visits to repair the school's electrical systems, using his position of trust to plant the instruments of destruction. State police investigators, led by Detective Sergeant Ernest Cobb, began piecing together a timeline of Kehoe's activities in the months leading up to the attack. They discovered that his purchases of explosives had been far more extensive than initially believed. Records from hardware stores and construction supply companies throughout the region showed that Kehoe had systematically acquired materials over nearly a year, never buying enough from any single source to raise suspicion but accumulating a devastating arsenal. The investigation into Kehoe's farm revealed additional horrors that painted a picture of a man consumed by rage and methodical in his destructiveness. Beyond the murder of his wife Nellie and the deliberate killing of his livestock, investigators found evidence that Kehoe had been systematically destroying his own property for months. Fences had been cut, equipment had been sabotaged, and crops had been poisoned or burned. It was as if he had been erasing his own existence piece by piece, preparing for a final act of violence that would cement his place in history. Dr. S. Senator, who had pledged $75,000 for the school's reconstruction, arrived in Bath 3 days after the bombing. His visit brought not only financial support, but also national attention to the community's plight. Cousins was deeply moved by what he witnessed, later writing to his wife that he had never seen such senseless destruction visited upon innocent children. His commitment to funding a new school provided the community with hope for the future, but it also raised questions about whether any building could truly be made safe from such determined malice. The medical response to the disaster highlighted both the heroism of individual responders and the limitations of rural health care in 1927. Dr. Crum worked continuously for over 36 hours treating the injured, assisted by nurses and volunteers who had traveled from as far away as Grand Rapids and Detroit. The University of Michigan Hospital dispatched a team of specialists, including surgeons experienced in treating traumatic injuries from industrial accidents. Many of the children who survived suffered from what would later be recognized as traumatic brain injuries, burns, and psychological trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Martha Horton, who had been a second grader at the time of the bombing, would later describe the long-term effects of her experience. The physical injuries healed relatively quickly, but the psychological impact proved more enduring. She spoke of nightmares that persisted for years, of an inability to feel safe in enclosed spaces, and of a hypervigilance that made normal childhood activities feel threatening. Her account was echoed by other survivors who described similar struggles with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The community's response to the tragedy revealed both the strength of rural American values and the limitations of the era's understanding of mass violence. Churches throughout the region organized prayer services and fundraising efforts. The Grange Halls became coordination centers for relief efforts. Neighboring farmers donated labor and materials for the cleanup and reconstruction. Yet there was also a sense of bewilderment, a struggle to comprehend how someone they had known and trusted could harbor such destructive intentions. Local newspaper editor Robert Gates, who had known Kehoe personally, wrote a series of articles attempting to understand the bomber's motivations. Gates described Kehoe as having been a man of contradictions, who could be charming and helpful one day, and irrationally angry the next. The editor noted that Kehoe's opposition to the school tax had been well known, but that many other residents had also been concerned about the financial burden without resorting to violence. What set Kehoe apart, Gates concluded, was not his grievances but his response to them. The investigation into Kehoe's background revealed a pattern of escalating antisocial behavior that had been overlooked or dismissed by his neighbors. His treatment of animals had been notably cruel, with multiple reports of him beating horses and killing pets belonging to others. His interactions with children had been marked by an unusual coldness, with several parents noting that their children seemed uncomfortable around him. Most significantly, his response to disagreement or opposition had often been disproportionately aggressive, though few had connected these incidents into a pattern that might have predicted such extreme violence. Federal authorities took notice of the Bath School Massacre as one of the first large-scale domestic terrorist attacks in American history. The Bureau of Investigation, which would later become the FBI, sent agents to study Kehoe's methods and motivations. Their analysis would contribute to the development of criminal profiling techniques and would inform later investigations of similar attacks. The agents were particularly interested in understanding how Kehoe had maintained his facade of normalcy while planning such extensive violence. The legal implications of the case were complicated by Kehoe's death in his own bombing. Had he survived, he would have faced charges of multiple counts of murder, arson, and destruction of property. Instead, the legal system was left to deal with his estate and the civil liability for the damages he had caused. His farm and remaining possessions were sold to partially compensate the victims' families, though the amounts were far from adequate to address the full scope of their losses. Educational authorities across the nation began reassessing school security procedures in the wake of the Bath bombing. While the concept of hardening schools against attack was still decades in the future, administrators did begin considering basic safety measures, such as restricting access to school buildings during off hours and conducting background checks on contractors and volunteers who worked in schools. The Michigan Department of Education issued guidelines for school construction that included recommendations for more robust building materials and improved emergency evacuation procedures. The psychological impact of the Bath School Massacre extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Teachers throughout Michigan and beyond reported increased anxiety about their safety and that of their students. Parents in rural communities began questioning whether their small towns were as safe as they had assumed. The bombing had shattered the illusion that such violence was limited to urban areas, or that small communities were somehow immune to mass violence. Religious leaders in Bath and surrounding communities struggled to provide comfort and meaning in the face of such senseless tragedy. Reverend McDonald of the Bath Community Church delivered a sermon the Sunday following the bombing in which he acknowledged that some questions have no satisfactory answers, that some evil defies explanation. His words resonated with many who were grappling with their faith in the aftermath of the attack. The bombing had confronted the community with the reality of evil in a way that challenged simple explanations and easy comfort. The media coverage of the Bath School Massacre established patterns that would be repeated in future mass violence events. Initial reports focused on the dramatic details of the explosions and the rescue efforts. Follow-up coverage sought to understand Kehoe's motivations and to identify warning signs that might have predicted his actions. Editorial commentary debated questions of individual responsibility versus societal factors. the role of mental illness in violent behavior, and the adequacy of existing security measures. Within weeks of the bombing, the Bath community had begun the process of moving forward while honoring the memory of those who had died. A memorial service held on June 1st drew thousands of attendees from across Michigan and beyond. The ceremony featured speeches by Governor Fred Greene and other dignitaries, but the most moving moments came from parents and survivors who shared their memories of the victims and their determination to rebuild. The reconstruction of the Bath School proceeded with remarkable speed, driven by the community's desire to restore normalcy for the surviving children and to demonstrate that Kehoe's violence had not achieved its ultimate goal of destroying their way of life. The new building incorporated safety features that were advanced for their time, including multiple exit routes, reinforced construction, and improved lighting. The weeks following Andrew Kehoe's carefully orchestrated massacre revealed a depth of planning that chilled investigators to their core. As rescue workers continued pulling bodies from the rubble and federal agents pieced together the bomber's methodical preparation, a disturbing picture emerged of a man who had spent nearly a year transforming his personal grievances into a weapon of mass destruction aimed at Bath Township's most vulnerable residents. The investigation into Kehoe's activities during the months leading up to the bombing uncovered a trail of deception and calculated malice that extended far beyond what anyone in the small Michigan community could have imagined. Federal investigators working alongside local authorities discovered that Kehoe had begun accumulating explosives as early as June 1926, nearly a full year before the attack. His purchases were systematic and deliberate, spread across multiple suppliers to avoid suspicion while he stockpiled the materials necessary for his vengeful plan. What made Kehoe's preparation particularly insidious was how he exploited his position of trust within the community. As the school board treasurer and a licensed electrician, he possessed both the access and the technical knowledge required to carry out his devastating scheme. School records revealed that Kehoe had volunteered for numerous maintenance projects throughout 1926 and early 1927, often working alone in the building during evening hours when no one else was present. Teachers and janitors who occasionally encountered him during these late-night sessions later recalled that he always seemed to be carrying tools and materials, explaining his presence as routine electrical work. The scope of Kehoe's preparation became clear when investigators examined the physical evidence left behind in the school's basement. The bomber had installed what amounted to a sophisticated remote detonation system, far more complex than anything typically seen in criminal cases of that era. Using his electrical expertise, Kehoe had wired hundreds of pounds of dynamite and pyrotol throughout the school's foundation, connecting the charges to a central triggering mechanism that could be activated from outside the building. The system included multiple redundancies and backup triggers, demonstrating both his technical skill and his determination to ensure maximum destruction. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery that Kehoe's original plan had been even more devastating than what actually occurred. Investigators found evidence that only approximately half of the explosives he had planted actually detonated during the morning blast. The unexploded ordnance included nearly 500 pounds of dynamite rigged with timing devices, along with large containers of gasoline positioned to create a massive fireball that would have consumed any survivors attempting to escape the initial explosion. Had Kehoe's complete system functioned as intended, virtually every person in the school building would have perished instantly. The failure of the secondary explosives to detonate appeared to be the result of a single severed wire, likely damaged during the initial blast. This small technical malfunction, investigators concluded, was all that prevented the Bath School massacre from claiming hundreds of additional lives. The randomness of this failure haunted many of those involved in the investigation, who realized how close the community had come to losing an entire generation of children in a single morning. As federal agents delved deeper into Kehoe's background and motivations, they uncovered a pattern of escalating antisocial behavior that had intensified dramatically in the months leading up to the attack. Neighbors who had initially described him as merely hot-tempered and difficult began recounting incidents that painted a picture of a man descending into dangerous obsession. Several farmers reported that Kehoe had become increasingly hostile during community meetings, often launching into lengthy tirades about taxation and government overreach that seemed disconnected from the actual issues being discussed. The investigation also revealed the calculated nature of Kehoe's final preparations in the days immediately before the bombing. Bank records showed that he had withdrawn substantial sums of money and converted much of his remaining assets to cash and bonds, which he then buried on his property. This suggested that he had initially considered fleeing after the attack, though investigators believed he ultimately decided on suicide as his final act of defiance against the community he blamed for his troubles. Most disturbing was the evidence surrounding the murder of Kehoe's wife, Nellie. The coroner's examination revealed that she had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head, likely administered while she slept. Given the timing of her death just 2 days before the school bombing, investigators concluded that Kehoe had murdered his wife to prevent her from potentially interfering with his plans or alerting authorities to his suspicious behavior. The cold-blooded nature of this preliminary killing underscored the complete absence of empathy or moral restraint that characterized Kehoe's final actions. The discovery of Kehoe's sign reading, "Criminals are made not born," sparked considerable debate among law enforcement officials and mental health experts who studied the case. Some interpreted this as Kehoe's attempt to justify his actions by blaming society for creating the conditions that drove him to violence. Others saw it as a manifestation of his narcissistic personality, reflecting his inability to accept responsibility for his own failures and destructive choices. The phrase would later become one of the most remembered aspects of the case, emblematic of how individuals can rationalize even the most heinous acts through twisted logic and self-serving narratives. As news of the bombing spread beyond Bath Township, the case attracted attention from federal authorities, who recognized its significance as one of the first acts of domestic terrorism targeting a school in American history. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, still a relatively new organization under Director J. Edgar Hoover, assigned a team of agents to study Kehoe's methods and motivations in order to develop profiles and procedures for preventing similar attacks. Their analysis would later influence federal approaches to investigating and preventing domestic terrorism, though the specific details of their findings remained classified for decades. The community's response to the tragedy revealed both the strength and fragility of small-town America in the 1920s. While neighbors rallied to support the victims' families and began the process of rebuilding, the psychological impact of Kehoe's betrayal created lasting divisions and suspicions that would persist for generations. Parents who had trusted the school to keep their children safe struggled with feelings of vulnerability and helplessness. Teachers and administrators grappled with the realization that the threat had come from within their own ranks, making it nearly impossible to detect or prevent. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Kehoe had been conducting surveillance of the school's daily routines and schedules in the weeks before the attack. Witnesses recalled seeing him parked near the building at various times, apparently observing arrival and dismissal procedures. This suggested that he had chosen the timing of his attack to maximize casualties, detonating the explosives when the building would be at its most crowded with students and staff beginning their daily activities. Perhaps most haunting was the discovery of Kehoe's detailed journals and planning documents, which revealed the methodical nature of his preparation and the depth of his hatred for the community. These writings, filled with grievances both real and imagined, provided insight into the mind of a man who had convinced himself that mass murder was a justified response to personal and financial disappointments. The journals also contained crude sketches of the school's layout and notes about the placement of explosives, evidence of the careful reconnaissance that had preceded the attack. The technical aspects of Kehoe's bombing system fascinated and horrified investigators who examined the remnants of his detonation equipment. His use of electrical timing devices and remote triggers was unprecedented in criminal cases of that era, demonstrating a level of sophistication that suggested considerable planning and experimentation. Some investigators theorized that Kehoe had practiced his techniques on his own property, using smaller charges to test his equipment and refine his methods before implementing the full-scale attack on the school. The randomness of survival and death in the bombing haunted everyone involved in the rescue efforts. Children sitting mere feet apart had vastly different fates, with some escaping with minor injuries while others were crushed instantly by falling debris. This arbitrary nature of the casualties added to the psychological trauma experienced by survivors and their families, who struggled to understand why some were spared while others perished. The guilt felt by surviving children and their parents would persist for decades, creating a lasting emotional scar on the entire community. As the immediate crisis response gave way to longer-term recovery efforts, Bath Township faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding not just its school, but its sense of security and trust. The bombing had shattered the community's faith in the basic assumption that schools were safe havens for children, forcing residents to confront the reality that evil could emerge from within their own ranks without warning or clear indication. The case also highlighted the vulnerabilities in school security and emergency preparedness that existed throughout rural America in the 1920s. Most schools had no security protocols beyond basic fire drills, and the concept of protecting students from deliberate attacks was virtually non-existent. The psychological scars left by Andrew Kehoe's calculated attack ran deeper than the physical destruction, creating wounds that would never fully heal for those who survived and the families who lost loved ones. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, the small community of Bath Township found itself thrust into a nightmare that defied comprehension. Parents who had sent their children to school that morning expecting them to return for summer vacation instead found themselves identifying bodies or desperately searching through rubble for any sign of life. The rescue efforts that followed the initial explosion revealed the true scope of Kehoe's meticulous planning. Emergency responders, many of whom were volunteers from neighboring communities, worked tirelessly to extract survivors from the collapsed North Wing. The scene was one of organized chaos, with makeshift medical stations set up in nearby buildings and volunteers forming human chains to pass debris and rescue equipment. Local physician Dr. A. Crum, who had been among the first to arrive at the scene, later described the experience as unlike anything he had encountered in his medical career. The injuries were severe and numerous, ranging from crushing wounds to severe burns from the explosive blast. What made the tragedy even more devastating was the discovery of Kehoe's backup plan. Investigators found that he had wired the entire school building with explosives, not just the north wing that had detonated. Had his timing device functioned properly, the entire structure would have been destroyed, killing every student and teacher inside. The 500 pounds of unexploded dynamite and pyrotol found in the basement served as a chilling reminder of how much worse the disaster could have been. The gasoline containers positioned throughout the building suggested that Kehoe had prepared multiple methods of destruction, ensuring that his plan would succeed regardless of which system activated first. The second explosion, which occurred when Kehoe detonated his truck bomb, added another layer of horror to an already unthinkable tragedy. Superintendent Emery Hoyk, who had dedicated his career to education and was beloved by students and faculty alike, became one of the final victims when he approached Kehoe's vehicle. Witnesses reported that Kehoe had called out to Hoyk, beckoning him over with what appeared to be an urgent matter to discuss. The subsequent explosion not only killed both men instantly, but also claimed the lives of several rescue workers and parents who had been helping with the recovery efforts. The investigation into Kehoe's background revealed a pattern of increasingly erratic and violent behavior that had escalated over the months leading up to the attack. Neighbors recalled incidents that, in hindsight, seemed like warning signs of his deteriorating mental state. His treatment of animals had become particularly cruel, with reports of him beating his horse to death and killing a neighbor's dog without provocation. These acts of violence, initially dismissed as isolated incidents of bad temper, were now seen as evidence of a mind capable of far greater atrocities. Kehoe's financial troubles had become a source of constant stress and resentment. His farm was heavily mortgaged, and the additional tax burden imposed to fund the new school had pushed him toward financial ruin. However, investigators found that his financial problems were largely self-inflicted. Rather than working to improve his situation, Kehoe had spent months neglecting his farm while preparing for his attack. He had deliberately destroyed crops, damaged equipment, and sabotaged his own property. Actions that suggested his planning went beyond simple revenge to include the complete destruction of his own life and legacy. The discovery of his wife Nellie's body added another disturbing dimension to the case. Medical examination revealed that she had been murdered approximately 2 days before the school bombing, likely on May 16th, shortly after her return from the hospital where she had been receiving treatment for tuberculosis. The manner of her death suggested that Kehoe had viewed her as an obstacle to his plans, or perhaps as another target of his rage against the world that he felt had wronged him. Her body was found positioned near valuable items including silverware, Liberty bonds, and cash, suggesting that Kehoe had been methodical even in his personal murders. The aftermath of the Bath School massacre sent shockwaves throughout the nation and prompted serious discussions about school security and the warning signs of violent behavior. Educational institutions across the country began implementing new safety protocols and screening procedures for anyone with access to school buildings. The tragedy also highlighted the need for better mental health awareness and intervention, though the understanding of psychological disorders in 1927 was far more limited than it is today. For the survivors, the trauma extended far beyond the physical injuries they sustained. Many of the children who lived through the explosion suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though such conditions were not well understood or treated at the time. Teachers and staff members who had been in the building during the attack struggled with survivors' guilt and recurring nightmares. The psychological impact on the broader community was equally profound, as residents grappled with the realization that someone they had known and trusted had been capable of such calculated evil. The media coverage of the Bath School massacre was extensive but relatively short-lived, as Charles Lindbergh's historic transatlantic flight just 2 days later captured the nation's attention and pushed the tragedy out of the headlines. This quick shift in public focus left many in the Bath community feeling that their loss had been forgotten or overshadowed by more positive news. The lack of sustained national attention also meant that there was less pressure for comprehensive investigations into how such an attack could be prevented in the future. In the years following the massacre, the Bath community worked to rebuild not just the physical structures that had been destroyed, but also the sense of security and trust that Kehoe's actions had shattered. The new school building, funded in part by donations from across the country, was constructed with enhanced safety features and became a symbol of the community's resilience. However, the psychological scars remained visible for generations, with many families passing down stories of the tragedy and its impact on their loved ones. The Bath School massacre stands as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences that can result from unchecked anger, financial desperation, and access to dangerous materials. Andrew Kehoe's ability to plan and execute such a comprehensive attack while maintaining the facade of a concerned community member highlighted vulnerabilities in the social fabric that are still relevant today. His case became one of the earliest examples of what would later be recognized as domestic terrorism, demonstrating how individuals with grievances against their communities could use their insider knowledge and access to cause maximum harm. The tragedy also raised important questions about the responsibility of communities to monitor and address concerning behavior among their members. While Kehoe's violent tendencies had been observed by neighbors and colleagues, the mechanisms for reporting and addressing such concerns were largely non-existent in 1927. The Bath School massacre thus became a catalyst for discussions about community vigilance and the importance of taking threats seriously, even when they come from seemingly respectable sources. Today, the Bath School massacre is remembered as a pivotal moment in American history, marking the beginning of a new era of concern about school safety and the potential for mass violence in educational settings. While the specific methods Kehoe used may have been unique to his time and circumstances, the underlying factors that drove him to commit such an atrocity remain relevant to understanding and preventing similar tragedies. As news of the Bath School massacre spread across America in the summer of 1927, the nation found itself grappling with an entirely new form of horror. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of violence. Andrew Kehoe had methodically planned and executed what would become known as America's first act of domestic terrorism targeting a school. The very deliberateness of his actions sent shockwaves through communities nationwide, forcing Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth about the vulnerabilities that existed within their own neighborhoods. The immediate aftermath in Bath Township was a study in human resilience amid unimaginable grief. Within hours of the explosions, the small farming community had transformed into a makeshift disaster zone. Volunteers arrived from neighboring towns, bringing medical supplies, food, and whatever assistance they could offer. The local general store became an impromptu command center where families gathered to search for missing loved ones and where rescue workers coordinated their efforts to locate any remaining survivors trapped beneath the rubble. Dr. A. Crum, who had rushed to the scene from nearby Lansing, later described the medical response as unlike anything he had encountered in his 30 years of practice. The injuries were not only severe, but unlike typical accident victims. Many of the children who survived bore wounds from the flying debris and structural collapse that would require months of recovery. Several would carry permanent disabilities as reminders of that horrific morning. The psychological trauma, however, would prove even more lasting and pervasive throughout the community. What made Kehoe's crime particularly chilling was the discovery of just how extensively he had infiltrated the very institution he targeted. As investigators continued examining the school building in the days following the attack, they uncovered evidence of his systematic preparation that painted a picture of calculated malevolence. Kehoe had not simply planted explosives haphazardly. Instead, he had conducted what amounted to an engineering study of the building's structural weaknesses, positioning his devices for maximum destructive impact. The wiring system he had installed was sophisticated beyond what most investigators had ever encountered. Kehoe had used his legitimate electrical work at the school as cover for installing what was essentially a coordinated detonation network throughout the building. He had carefully studied the daily routines of students and teachers, timing his attack for maximum occupancy. The unused explosives found in the basement suggested his original plan would have brought down the entire structure, potentially killing every person inside. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that Kehoe had tested his methods beforehand. Investigators found remnants of smaller explosive devices on his farm property, along with notebooks containing calculations about blast radii and structural damage. These weren't the random scribblings of a madman, but the methodical preparations of someone who approached mass murder with the same systematic attention he might have applied to any other project. The community's response to these revelations was complex and deeply divided. Some residents expressed disbelief that someone they had known and worked alongside could harbor such deadly intentions. Kehoe had served on the school board for years, participating in discussions about the children's education and the building's maintenance. He had attended community gatherings, church services, and local meetings. To many, he had seemed like any other member of their tight-knit rural community, perhaps more argumentative than most, but nothing that suggested the capacity for such horrific violence. Others, however, began recalling incidents and behaviors that had seemed merely eccentric or unpleasant at the time, but took on sinister significance in retrospect. Several neighbors mentioned Kehoe's explosive temper and his tendency to hold grudges over seemingly minor disagreements. His treatment of animals had raised eyebrows among farming families who understood the difference between necessary discipline and cruelty. His obsessive focus on the school taxes had seemed like the complaints of a frugal man rather than the grievances of someone planning revenge. The investigation into Kehoe's background revealed a pattern of escalating antisocial behavior that had gone largely unnoticed or had been dismissed as personality quirks. Born in 1872 in Tecumseh, Michigan, Andrew Philip Kehoe had grown up in a farming family where he was known for his intelligence and mechanical aptitude. However, even as a young man, he had displayed what neighbors described as an unusual need to control situations and people around him. His marriage to Nellie Price in 1912 had initially seemed to stabilize him. Nellie was well regarded in the community, known for her kindness and involvement in local charitable activities. However, those close to the couple later revealed that their relationship had become increasingly strained in the years leading up to the massacre. Nellie had confided to friends that Andrew had become more controlling and suspicious, often accusing her of disloyalty over trivial matters. The couple's inability to have children had been a source of particular bitterness for Kehoe. Several community members recalled his resentful comments about supporting schools through his tax dollars when he had no children to benefit from the education system. This grievance had grown into an obsession that consumed more and more of his thoughts and conversations. What had begun as complaints about fiscal responsibility had evolved into a deep-seated hatred of the school and everything it represented to him. Kehoe's financial troubles, while real, were not as severe as he had portrayed them to be. The mortgage foreclosure he faced was not immediate, and several options existed for resolving his debts. However, he had become fixated on the idea that his community had betrayed him by voting for school improvements that increased his tax burden. In his mind, the school had become the symbol of everything that was wrong with his life, the focal point for all his frustrations and disappointments. The planning phase of his attack had begun almost immediately after his electoral defeat in 1926. Kehoe had run for the position of township clerk, a role he had been filling temporarily, but lost to a more popular candidate. This rejection by the voters had triggered what investigators would later recognize as a complete psychological break from reality. Rather than accepting the democratic process, Kehoe had interpreted his loss as a personal attack by the entire community. His subsequent behavior demonstrated a level of cunning that contradicted any claims of mental illness or diminished capacity. Kehoe had carefully researched explosives, studying military manuals and consulting with suppliers about the most effective types of dynamite for different applications. He had told merchants that he needed the explosives for clearing stumps and other farm work, explanations that seemed perfectly reasonable for a landowner in rural Michigan. The theft of additional explosives from the nearby bridge construction site showed premeditation and criminal sophistication. Kehoe had observed the work site's routines, identified security weaknesses, and systematically stolen materials over several months without detection. He had then transported and stored these dangerous materials on his property while maintaining the appearance of normal farm operations. His access to the school building had been legitimate, but he had abused that trust in the most heinous way possible. As the board member responsible for maintenance issues, and as an electrician hired to upgrade the building's systems, Kehoe had keys and could enter the building at any time without suspicion. He had used evening and weekend access to install his deadly network, working methodically over many months to position explosives throughout the structure. The discovery of his wife's murder added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime. Nellie Kehoe had been killed with a blunt instrument, likely a hammer, and her body had been carefully positioned on their property where it would be found after the school attack. She had been released from the hospital just 2 days before the massacre, still weak from her illness, making her completely vulnerable to her husband's violence. Investigators theorized that Kehoe had killed his wife to prevent her from potentially interfering with his plans or alerting authorities to his preparations. There was evidence that Nellie had become suspicious of her husband's activities in the weeks before her death. She had asked neighbors about the strange smells coming from their basement and had mentioned finding unfamiliar materials in their outbuildings. The systematic destruction of Kehoe's farm property revealed the depth of his nihilistic rage. He had not only wired his buildings with explosives, but had also poisoned his livestock and destroyed his crops. The fire that consumed his property had been set using multiple ignition points, ensuring complete destruction. This wasn't simply about covering evidence. It was about eliminating every trace of his life in the community that had rejected him. The sign he left behind, declaring that criminals are made not born, represented Kehoe's final attempt to justify his actions and shift blame to society. Rather than accepting responsibility for his choices, he portrayed himself as the victim of circumstances beyond his control. This self-serving narrative ignored the reality that hundreds of other community members faced similar financial pressures and disappointments without resorting to mass murder. The nationwide reaction to the Bath School massacre reflected America's struggle to understand and categorize this new form of violence. Editorial writers and public officials searched for explanations that would make sense of Kehoe's actions while providing reassurance that such events could be prevented in the future. Some focused on the need for better mental health identification and treatment, though the evidence suggested Kehoe had been fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Others emphasized the importance of community vigilance and the dangers of social isolation. Kehoe's gradual withdrawal from normal community interactions had been noted by some residents, but no one had connected his antisocial behavior to a potential for violence. The massacre highlighted the difficulty of identifying individuals who might pose threats while maintaining the open, trusting relationships that characterized small communities. The response from law enforcement agencies nationwide was swift and comprehensive. Police departments began developing protocols for investigating threats against schools and other public buildings. The sophisticated nature of Kehoe's explosive devices prompted new training programs for bomb disposal and investigation techniques. Federal agencies recognized that domestic terrorism required different approaches than traditional criminal activity. Educational institutions across the country began reassessing their security measures and emergency procedures. While schools had always been considered safe havens for children, the Bath massacre forced administrators to confront the reality that these institutions could become targets for individuals seeking to inflict maximum psychological damage on communities. New policies regarding building access, visitor screening, and employee background checks became standard practices. The psychological impact on survivors and community members would prove to be one of the most lasting consequences of Kehoe's attack. Children who had been in the building during the explosion suffered not only from physical injuries but from trauma that would affect them for decades. Many developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty concentrating that interfered with their ability to continue their education and normal development. The broader Bath Township community struggled with collective trauma that manifested in various ways. Some families moved away, unable to remain in a place associated with such horror. Others became overprotective of their children, reluctant to allow them out of sight or to participate in normal childhood activities. The sense of safety and trust that had characterized the rural community was permanently shattered. Religious leaders in the area found themselves grappling with theological questions about evil and suffering that had no easy answers. How could God allow innocent children to be killed in such a brutal manner? How could evil hide so successfully within their community? These questions challenged traditional religious explanations and forced many residents to wrestle with doubts about their faith and their understanding of human nature. The memorial services for the victims became a focal point for the community's grief and an attempt to find meaning in senseless tragedy. 38 small coffins containing the bodies of children who had been looking forward to summer vacation just hours before created an image that seared itself into the national consciousness. The funeral processions through Bath Township seemed to include the entire population of the area, united in mourning for their lost children and teachers. Media coverage of the massacre, while extensive, was limited by the communication technology and social sensibilities of 1927. Newspapers provided detailed accounts of the investigation and recovery efforts, but graphic photographs of the destruction were generally not published out of respect for the victims' families. Radio broadcasts brought news of the tragedy to national audiences, but without the immediate visual impact that would characterize later media coverage of similar events. The relatively brief period of national attention given to the Bath massacre, overshadowed by Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight just 2 days later, reflected the different media landscape of the 1920s. Without continuous news cycles or social media amplification, even horrific events could fade from public consciousness relatively quickly. This allowed Bath Township to begin its healing process without the sustained media scrutiny that would complicate recovery efforts for communities affected by later tragedies. However, the lessons learned from Kehoe's attack would influence American approaches to school safety and domestic terrorism for generations. The recognition that trusted community members could pose the greatest threats led to new screening procedures and oversight mechanisms. The understanding that sophisticated planning could enable individuals to inflict massive casualties prompted new investigative techniques and prevention strategies. The Bath School Massacre stands as a tragic milestone in American history, marking the beginning of an era when schools could no longer be considered automatically safe from violence. Andrew Kehoe's calculated attack demonstrated that evil could hide behind familiar faces and that the most dangerous threats might come from within communities rather than from outside forces. The Bath School Massacre case marked a turning point in how America viewed school safety and the potential for calculated domestic terrorism, but its aftermath revealed troubling patterns that would echo through decades of American violence. The immediate response to the tragedy, while demonstrating remarkable community resilience, also exposed critical vulnerabilities in how society recognizes and addresses warning signs of extreme violence. In the weeks following the bombing, investigators working to understand how such an attack could have been prevented began documenting a disturbing timeline of escalating behaviors that had been dismissed or overlooked by the Bath Township community. Andrew Kehoe's transformation from respected community member to mass murderer hadn't happened overnight, and the warning signs had been accumulating for years before anyone recognized their significance. Dr. Morrison wrote that Kehoe had demonstrated classic signs of what would later be recognized as targeted violence planning, including social withdrawal, increasing paranoia, detailed planning phases, and the gradual acquisition of materials needed for his attack. What made Kehoe's case particularly disturbing to investigators was the methodical nature of his preparation combined with his ability to maintain a facade of normalcy. Neighbors later recalled that even as Kehoe was systematically destroying his own property and stockpiling explosives, he continued to attend school board meetings, fulfill his electrical work obligations, and participate in community events. This duality between his public persona and private preparations would become a recurring theme in later cases of planned mass violence. The investigation also revealed that Kehoe had been conducting what amounted to surveillance of the school for months before the attack. Teacher Ida Hall's observations of someone carrying boxes into the building at night represented just a fraction of Kehoe's reconnaissance activities. School custodian William Robb later testified that he had found evidence of someone accessing the building's basement and utility areas during off hours, but had assumed it was related to routine maintenance work. More chilling was the discovery that Kehoe had been testing his explosive devices and timing mechanisms on his own property for weeks before the attack. Neighbors reported hearing unusual blasts from the Kehoe farm throughout the winter and spring of 1927, but had attributed them to normal farming activities like stump removal. These test explosions had allowed Kehoe to refine his techniques and ensure maximum destructive capability when he implemented his plan. The psychological profile that emerged from interviews with those who knew Kehoe painted a picture of a man whose sense of grievance had become all-consuming. Beyond his resentment over school taxes and his electoral defeat, investigators discovered that Kehoe harbored deep-seated anger about multiple aspects of his life. His farm was failing financially, his wife's illness had created mounting medical expenses, and he felt increasingly isolated from a community he believed had rejected and betrayed him. Dr. Morrison's analysis suggested that Kehoe's decision to target the school represented both symbolic and practical motivations. Symbolically, the school embodied everything he resented about the community's priorities and expenditures. Practically, it offered the opportunity to inflict maximum casualties on the families he blamed for his troubles, while ensuring his own death would be remembered as something more than suicide. The discovery of Kehoe's backup plans revealed the true scope of his intended destruction. In addition to the unexploded dynamite found in the school's basement and the gasoline containers positioned throughout the building, investigators found evidence that Kehoe had considered multiple scenarios for his attack. Timing devices suggested he had originally planned to detonate all explosives simultaneously during peak school hours, which would have resulted in casualties potentially exceeding 400 people. The fact that only half of Kehoe's explosives detonated likely prevented the Bath School Massacre from becoming the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. Technical analysis of the failed devices indicated that moisture in the basement had compromised some of the electrical connections Kehoe had installed, while others appeared to have been deliberately disabled by Kehoe himself in the final moments before his attack. This last-minute modification to his plan puzzled investigators until they discovered Kehoe's final written statement, found in his truck after the explosion. The note, largely destroyed but partially legible, suggested that Kehoe had experienced some form of internal conflict about the full scope of his intended violence. However, rather than abandoning his plan entirely, he had simply reduced its scale while ensuring his own death would still deliver a devastating blow to the community. The investigation into Kehoe's financial dealings revealed another disturbing aspect of his planning. In the months before the attack, he had systematically liquidated assets, withdrawn savings, and arranged his affairs in ways that suggested long-term premeditation. Insurance policies had been adjusted, property transfers completed, and debt strategically managed to maximize the impact of his final destructive acts. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that Kehoe had been monitoring other school-related incidents across the country, collecting newspaper clippings about school fires, accidents, and violence. This research had informed his understanding of how to maximize both casualties and media attention, revealing a level of calculation that went far beyond simple revenge against his immediate community. The response of Bath Township residents to these revelations was complex and often contradictory. Many struggled to reconcile their memories of Kehoe as a competent, if difficult, community member with the evidence of his methodical planning for mass murder. Some residents expressed guilt about having missed or dismissed warning signs, while others insisted that nothing could have prepared them for such an unprecedented act of violence. The trauma experienced by survivors extended far beyond the immediate physical injuries and deaths. Children who had been in the school during the explosion reported persistent nightmares, anxiety about attending school, and difficulty trusting adults who were supposed to protect them. Teachers and staff who survived struggled with survivors' guilt and the challenge of returning to work in an environment that had been so thoroughly violated. Parents throughout the community grappled with questions about how to explain such senseless violence to their children while maintaining some sense of safety and normalcy. The fact that the attack had been perpetrated by someone they knew and trusted made these conversations even more difficult, as it shattered fundamental assumptions about community safety and the reliability of social bonds. The broader impact on American society was equally significant, though often overshadowed by other news events of the time. The Bath School Massacre represented the first large-scale planned attack on a school in American history, establishing a template for targeted violence that would unfortunately be repeated in various forms throughout the following decades. Educational professionals across the country began questioning their own security arrangements and vulnerability to similar attacks. The revelation that Kehoe had used his position as an electrician and school board member to gain access for his planning raised uncomfortable questions about how well communities really knew the people they trusted with positions of authority and access. Law enforcement agencies also began developing new approaches to threat assessment and investigation of suspicious activities. The Bath case demonstrated that traditional criminal investigation techniques were inadequate for identifying and preventing planned mass violence, particularly when perpetrators maintained facades of respectability while conducting their preparations. The psychological and sociological implications of the case continue to influence academic research and policy development for decades. Kehoe's transformation from community member to mass murderer became a subject of study for those trying to understand how grievance and resentment could escalate into extreme violence, and what intervention points might exist to prevent such escalation. The Bath School Massacre thus stands as both a singular tragedy and a harbinger of future challenges American society would face in preventing and responding to targeted violence. The case revealed fundamental vulnerabilities in community safety systems while demonstrating the devastating potential when individual grievance, technical capability, and determination to cause harm converge in a single person willing to sacrifice everything, including their own life, to inflict maximum suffering on others. As news of Andrew Kehoe's meticulously planned assault spread beyond Bath Township, The reverberations of America's first school bombing began to reshape how the nation understood domestic terrorism and mass violence. The immediate aftermath revealed the full scope of Kehoe's calculated brutality, but it also exposed critical vulnerabilities in American communities that few had previously considered. The investigation into Kehoe's preparations uncovered a chilling timeline of premeditation that stretched back nearly a year. Neighbors who had witnessed his late-night visits to the school building suddenly understood the sinister purpose behind what they had dismissed as routine maintenance work. The boxes they had seen him carrying contained not repair supplies, but the instruments of mass destruction. Local hardware store owners came forward with records showing Kehoe's systematic purchases of dynamite, blasting caps, and timing devices from multiple suppliers across the region, a deliberate strategy to avoid suspicion that demonstrated his methodical approach to planning the massacre. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Kehoe had conducted test explosions on his own property throughout the winter and spring of 1927. Farmers in the area had grown accustomed to the sound of blasting, assuming Kehoe was clearing stumps or breaking up frozen ground. In reality, he had been perfecting his techniques, experimenting with different explosive combinations and timing mechanisms to ensure maximum devastation when he implemented his final plan. Investigators found evidence of at least 15 separate test detonations, each one bringing him closer to the lethal efficiency he would demonstrate at the school. The sophistication of Kehoe's electrical work inside the school building shocked even experienced investigators. Using his position as the school board's treasurer and his expertise as an electrician, he had installed what amounted to a sophisticated bomb network throughout the structure. Wires ran through walls and under floorboards, connecting charges in the basement to a central detonation point that he could trigger remotely. The system included backup triggers and multiple redundancies, suggesting that Kehoe had studied demolition techniques far beyond what his farming background would typically require. Federal agents brought in to assist the local investigation discovered that Kehoe had been corresponding with munitions suppliers and had somehow acquired detailed blueprints of the school's construction. These documents, found among his personal effects, were marked with calculations determining optimal placement for explosive charges to ensure maximum structural collapse. The level of technical knowledge required for such planning indicated that Kehoe had spent considerable time researching building demolition, possibly consulting engineering texts or correspondence with construction professionals. The community's response to these revelations evolved from shock to a deeper, more complex trauma. Parents who had initially focused their grief on the immediate tragedy now grappled with the realization that their children had been targeted by someone they had trusted. Kehoe hadn't simply snapped in a moment of rage. He had systematically planned their deaths for months while maintaining his facade as a concerned community member. This betrayal of trust created a psychological wound that extended far beyond the physical destruction. Local pastor Reverend Samuel McClure, who had conducted many of the funeral services for the victims, later reflected on the community's struggle to comprehend the calculated nature of Kehoe's actions. The idea that someone could plan such methodical violence against children challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and community safety. Unlike crimes of passion or even random violence, Kehoe's systematic approach suggested a level of deliberate malice that seemed almost incomprehensible to the rural farming community. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Kehoe had manipulated his position of authority to facilitate his plan. As school board treasurer, he had access not only to the building but to detailed information about daily schedules, student attendance patterns, and staff routines. He had used this privileged information to time his attack for maximum casualties, selecting the final day of the school year when attendance would be highest and students would be gathered in predictable locations. Evidence suggested that Kehoe had originally planned an even more devastating attack. The 500 pounds of unexploded dynamite found in the school's basement represented only half of his intended payload. Had the complete explosive system functioned as designed, investigators estimated that the entire three-story building would have been reduced to rubble, likely killing every person inside. The failure of the southern wing explosives to detonate may have been due to a wiring malfunction or moisture damage, factors that prevented what could have been the complete annihilation of Bath Township's children. The discovery of Kehoe's wife Nellie's murder added another layer of horror to the case. Medical examination revealed that she had been killed by blunt force trauma, likely from a hammer or similar tool found near her body. The positioning of her corpse alongside valuable items suggested that Kehoe had murdered her as part of his systematic destruction of his own life before turning his violence outward toward the community. Her death appeared to have been carefully timed to coincide with his broader plan, eliminating any potential interference with his preparations. Federal investigators found evidence that Kehoe had been liquidating his assets and settling his affairs in the weeks leading up to the bombing. Bank records showed large cash withdrawals, and he had sold livestock and equipment at below-market prices, suggesting he never intended to survive his attack. This financial evidence supported the theory that the Bath School bombing was conceived as Kehoe's final act, a calculated revenge against a community he blamed for his personal failures. The technical sophistication of Kehoe's methods prompted the first serious federal examination of domestic terrorism threats. The Bureau of Investigation, predecessor to the FBI, compiled detailed reports on Kehoe's techniques and began developing protocols for investigating similar threats. The case highlighted the vulnerability of public buildings to insider attacks and the potential for individuals with specialized knowledge to exploit their positions for violent purposes. Military explosive experts brought in to examine Kehoe's methods were struck by the professional quality of his work. His use of multiple initiation systems, backup detonators, and carefully calculated charge placement suggested training or knowledge beyond what a typical farmer would possess. This raised questions about where Kehoe had acquired such expertise and whether similar knowledge was accessible to other potential perpetrators. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation painted Kehoe as a man consumed by resentment and grandiose delusions. His extensive diary, discovered in the ruins of his farmhouse, revealed months of increasingly paranoid thoughts about perceived slights and injustices. He had convinced himself that the school tax burden was part of a deliberate conspiracy to destroy him financially, and he viewed his violent response as justified retaliation against an entire community he saw as complicit in his persecution. The Bath School Massacre fundamentally changed how American communities thought about security and trust. The idea that a respected community member could methodically plan mass murder challenged basic assumptions about social cohesion and safety. Schools across the nation began implementing new security measures, though the concept of comprehensive threat assessment was still decades away. The tragedy demonstrated that the greatest dangers could come from within trusted institutions, rather than from external threats. The case also exposed the limitations of early 20th century mental health understanding. While some observers attributed Kehoe's actions to insanity, the calculated nature of his planning suggested a level of rational thought that complicated simple explanations. Modern psychological analysis would likely focus on personality disorders and the intersection of grievance, capability, and opportunity that enabled Kehoe's violence. His ability to maintain normal social interactions while planning mass murder illustrated the potential for hidden pathology within seemingly ordinary individuals. As the immediate crisis passed and Bath Township began the slow process of healing, the broader implications of Kehoe's actions continued to resonate throughout American society. The bombing had demonstrated that domestic terrorism could emerge from the most unexpected sources, and that the tools of modern technology could be turned toward devastating violence by individuals with sufficient knowledge and motivation. The investigation into the Bath School Massacre revealed a level of premeditation and calculation that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials who had dealt with violent crimes throughout their careers. As authorities sifted through the wreckage of Andrew Kehoe's farm and examined the sophisticated explosive devices he had constructed, they began to understand that this wasn't the impulsive act of a man who had simply snapped under pressure. This was something far more sinister. A methodical campaign of destruction that had been planned with meticulous attention to detail over the course of nearly a year. Federal agents working alongside local investigators discovered that Kehoe had essentially turned his property into a testing ground for his murderous scheme. Scorch marks on trees and rocks scattered throughout his farmland indicated that he had conducted multiple test explosions, experimenting with different combinations of dynamite and pyrotol to determine the most effective methods for maximum destruction. Neighbors who had dismissed these sounds as routine farm work, clearing stumps, now realized they had been witnessing something far more ominous: the rehearsals for mass murder. The depth of Kehoe's preparation became even more apparent when investigators examined his financial records and discovered a pattern of purchases that painted a chilling picture of long-term planning. Between June 1926 and May 1927, he had systematically acquired explosives from no fewer than 8 different suppliers across 3 counties, carefully spacing his purchases to avoid arousing suspicion. The quantities were staggering. Over the course of 11 months, Kehoe had obtained more than 600 pounds of dynamite, 300 pounds of pyrotol, and dozens of detonation devices, including timers, electrical switches, and backup ignition systems. What made his acquisition strategy particularly cunning was how he leveraged his legitimate need for explosives as a farmer to mask his true intentions. Agricultural use of dynamite for stump removal and land clearing was common in rural Michigan, and Kehoe's background as an electrician made him a logical customer for the more sophisticated blasting equipment. Store owners who later testified to investigators described him as knowledgeable and professional in his purchases, never displaying any behavior that would have raised red flags about his ultimate intentions. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Kehoe's preparation was the discovery of detailed journals and sketches hidden in a metal box beneath the floorboards of his farmhouse. These documents, some written in code that took investigators weeks to decipher, revealed the true scope of his planning and the cold calculation behind every aspect of his scheme. The journals showed that Kehoe had spent months studying the school's structure, documenting the daily routines of students and staff, and identifying the optimal locations for placing explosives to ensure maximum casualties. One entry, dated September 15, 1926, demonstrated the methodical nature of his observations. Kehoe had written, "North wing foundation shows stress points near supporting columns. Basement access unmonitored during evening hours. Electrical work provides cover for extended time in building." The clinical detachment of his language was perhaps even more chilling than the violent intentions it described. The investigation also revealed that Kehoe had conducted extensive research into the school's construction blueprints, somehow obtaining copies of the architectural plans that showed the precise location of load-bearing walls and support structures. How he acquired these documents remained a mystery, but their presence among his papers indicated a level of preparation that went far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. He hadn't simply planted explosives randomly throughout the building. He had strategically positioned them at the exact points where they would cause the most catastrophic structural failure. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Kehoe had created multiple contingency plans for his attack. The investigators found evidence of at least 3 different explosive configurations he had considered, each designed to address potential complications or failures in his primary scheme. The gasoline containers found in the school's basement weren't just backup devices. They were part of an elaborate secondary system that would have ensured the building's destruction, even if the main explosive charges somehow failed to detonate properly. The sophistication of his electrical work at the school also took on a sinister new meaning as investigators pieced together his methodology. Under the guise of routine maintenance and repairs, Kehoe had spent countless hours in the building's basement and utility areas, installing not just explosives, but an intricate network of wiring that would allow him to trigger the devices remotely. His expertise as an electrician had given him the knowledge to create a system that was both reliable and virtually undetectable to anyone without specialized training in explosives. Perhaps most chillingly, the investigation revealed that Kehoe had originally planned an even more devastating attack. Documents found in his possession showed that he had initially considered targeting not just the school, but also the town's main church and community center. which would have been filled with families attending a special end-of-school-year celebration. Only logistical concerns about coordinating multiple simultaneous explosions had apparently led him to focus his efforts solely on the school building. The timeline of Kehoe's final preparations painted a picture of a man who remained coldly rational, even as he prepared to commit mass murder. In the weeks leading up to the attack, he had methodically destroyed evidence of his planning, burning most of his research materials and notes while carefully preserving only the operational details he needed for the final phase of his scheme. He had also taken steps to ensure that his property would be completely destroyed, apparently hoping to eliminate any evidence that might help investigators understand his motives or methods. The murder of his wife Nellie appeared to have been planned with the same cold calculation as the school attack. Medical examination of her body revealed that she had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head, inflicted with a heavy farming implement that was later found among the debris of Kehoe's burned barn. The timing of her murder, just 2 days before the school bombing, suggested that Kehoe had been following a precise schedule that left nothing to chance. Even his final act, the car bombing that killed Superintendent Hoyk and several others, showed evidence of careful planning. The vehicle had been loaded with not just explosives, but also metal fragments and farm implements designed to maximize casualties within a specific radius. Witnesses who survived the blast reported that Kehoe had positioned his truck with apparent deliberation, ensuring that it was close enough to the rescue workers and officials to cause maximum damage when detonated. The investigation's most troubling discovery, however, was evidence that Kehoe may not have been working entirely alone. While no co-conspirators were ever identified or charged, investigators found correspondence suggesting that he had discussed his grievances against the school board and the community with several other disgruntled residents. Whether any of these individuals had knowledge of his specific plans remained unclear, but the possibility that others might have been aware of his intentions without reporting them to authorities added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime. As investigators continued their work throughout the summer of 1927, they began to understand that the Bath School Massacre represented something unprecedented in American criminal history. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of terrorism designed to inflict maximum psychological trauma on an entire community. Kehoe hadn't simply wanted to kill. He had wanted to destroy the very foundation of trust and security that held the community together. The evidence suggested that Kehoe had studied not just the physical vulnerabilities of his targets, but also their emotional and psychological weak points. His decision to attack on the last day of the school year, when children and families would be celebrating the end of another academic year and looking forward to summer vacation, was calculated to maximize the traumatic impact of his actions. He had chosen a moment when the community's guard was down and their spirits were highest, deliberately turning a time of joy and anticipation into one of horror and grief. The meticulous nature of Kehoe's planning also revealed a disturbing level of patience and self-control. For nearly a year, he had lived among his intended victims, attending school board meetings, participating in community events, and maintaining the facade of a concerned citizen while secretly preparing for mass murder. His ability to sustain this deception for such an extended period suggested a level of psychological compartmentalization that investigators found deeply unsettling. Perhaps most disturbingly, the investigation revealed that Kehoe had apparently taken pleasure in his preparations, documenting his progress with the same attention to detail that a craftsman might bring to a beloved project. His journals contained not just operational plans, but also personal reflections on his anticipated revenge against the community that he felt had wronged him. The tone of these writings suggested a man who saw himself not as a criminal, but as an agent of justice, carrying out a necessary punishment against those who had failed to appreciate his contributions and had rejected his leadership. As the investigation drew to a close, law enforcement officials found themselves grappling with questions that went far beyond the specifics of Kehoe's crime. How could such an elaborate plan for mass murder have been carried out without detection? What warning signs might have been missed? And perhaps most importantly, How could communities protect themselves against individuals who possessed both the technical skills and the psychological motivation to carry out such devastating attacks? The Bath School Massacre had revealed vulnerabilities in American society that few had previously considered. The very openness and trust that characterized small-town communities could be exploited by those with malicious intent. The expertise and access that came with respected positions in the community could be turned into weapons against the innocent. And the democratic processes that were supposed to channel disagreement and conflict into peaceful resolution could instead fuel resentment and revenge in those who couldn't accept the will of the majority. These realizations would have profound implications for how Americans thought about school safety, community security, and the potential for violence from within their own ranks. The Bath School Massacre had shown that the greatest threats didn't always come from obvious sources or dangerous strangers. The immediate aftermath of the Bath School Massacre sent shockwaves through the small Michigan community and far beyond. As rescue workers continued pulling bodies from the rubble and investigators processed the horrific crime scene, the full scope of Andrew Kehoe's calculated destruction became devastatingly clear. The man who had been trusted as a school board member, who had walked freely through the halls of Bath Consolidated School, had methodically planned the annihilation of an entire generation of children. In the days following May 18, 1927, the community of Bath found itself thrust into a nightmare of grief and disbelief. 43 funerals were held in the space of just over a week. The town's small cemetery became a heartbreaking testament to the tragedy, with rows of small headstones marking the graves of children who should have been celebrating the start of their summer vacation. Parents who had sent their children to school that morning expecting them home for lunch instead found themselves selecting coffins and planning memorial services. The psychological trauma extended far beyond the immediate families of the victims. Survivors of the blast, many of them children themselves, struggled to make sense of what had happened. Some had been pulled from the rubble with broken bones and severe injuries, while others escaped physical harm but carried invisible wounds that would last a lifetime. Teachers who had been in the building described the terror of hearing the explosion, feeling the floor collapse beneath them, and desperately trying to protect their students as debris rained down around them. Martha Hike, a teacher who survived the blast, later recalled the moments immediately following the explosion. She described how the air filled with dust and screams, how she could barely see through the chaos, and how she instinctively began calling out to her students, hoping to hear their voices in response. Some answered back, trapped but alive under the wreckage. Others fell silent forever. The memory of those unanswered calls would haunt her for the rest of her life. The community's response to the tragedy revealed both the resilience and the deep fractures created by Kehoe's actions. Neighbors who had known each other for years found themselves questioning everything they thought they understood about their small town. How had they missed the signs? How had a man they had trusted with their children's education been plotting their destruction? The revelation that Kehoe had been secretly placing explosives in the school basement for months while serving on the school board added layers of betrayal to an already incomprehensible crime. Local businesses and organizations immediately mobilized to support the victims' families. The Bath Township's small general store became an informal headquarters for coordinating aid, with volunteers organizing food deliveries, childcare for surviving siblings, and assistance with funeral arrangements. Churches throughout the region held special services, not just for the victims, but for the entire community struggling to process the magnitude of the loss. The investigation into Kehoe's methodical planning revealed disturbing details about his mental state in the months leading up to the massacre. Neighbors reported that his behavior had become increasingly erratic after his failed election bid for township clerk. He had stopped maintaining his farm, allowed crops to wither, and spent hours alone in his barn working on unknown projects. His wife Nellie had confided to friends that Andrew had become withdrawn and angry, muttering about the school taxes and the people who had voted against him. What made Kehoe's crime particularly chilling was the calculated nature of his preparations. This was not a moment of sudden rage or a spontaneous act of violence. Investigators found evidence that he had been acquiring explosives for nearly a year, carefully timing his purchases to avoid suspicion. He had researched the school's construction, identifying the most structurally vulnerable points for maximum damage. His work as an electrician had given him the technical knowledge to wire the explosives professionally, ensuring they would detonate with devastating effect. The discovery of additional unexploded dynamite in the school's basement revealed the true scope of Kehoe's intended destruction. Had all the explosives detonated as planned, the entire building would have been obliterated, potentially killing every child and teacher inside. The failure of the second wave of explosives to detonate was later attributed to a wiring error, a small technical mistake that saved dozens of additional lives. News of the Bath School massacre spread rapidly across the nation, carried by newspaper headlines and radio broadcasts. The story captured the attention of a country still grappling with the social changes of the 1920s. Rural communities everywhere found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about safety, trust, and the potential for violence in their own neighborhoods. The idea that a school, a place considered sacred and safe, could become the target of such calculated brutality challenged fundamental assumptions about American society. Media coverage of the tragedy reflected the era's limited understanding of mental health and criminal psychology. Many newspapers focused on trying to identify a single cause for Kehoe's actions, speculating about financial troubles, political resentment, or possible head injuries that might have triggered his violent behavior. The complexity of his planning and the methodical nature of his preparations were often overlooked in favor of simpler explanations that would make the incomprehensible seem more manageable. The response from government officials was swift but largely symbolic. Politicians expressed outrage and sympathy, but there was little discussion of policy changes or preventive measures. The concept of school security was virtually non-existent in 1927, and the idea that schools might need protection from deliberate attacks was so foreign that few could imagine implementing safeguards against such threats. In the weeks following the massacre, Bath Township faced the practical challenge of rebuilding not just a school, but a community's sense of safety and trust. The surviving children needed to complete their education, but the thought of returning to any school building filled many with terror. Temporary classrooms were established in various locations throughout the township, but attendance remained sporadic as parents struggled with their own fears about their children's safety. The psychological impact on the surviving students was profound and long-lasting. Many experienced what would later be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, though such terminology did not exist in 1927. Children who had escaped physical injury nonetheless suffered from nightmares, anxiety, and an inability to concentrate on their studies. Some refused to enter any building that reminded them of the school, while others became obsessively worried about their parents' safety when separated from them. The tragedy also exposed the limitations of the era's emergency response capabilities. Bath Township had no hospital, no professional fire department, and no coordinated disaster response plan. The rescue efforts, while heroic, were largely improvised by community members who had no training in dealing with such catastrophic events. The medical care available to the injured was basic, and several victims who might have survived with modern emergency medicine succumbed to their injuries in the hours and days following the blast. Despite these limitations, the community's response demonstrated remarkable resilience and solidarity. Farmers abandoned their spring planting to help with rescue efforts. Women organized around-the-clock care for the injured and support for grieving families. Local businesses donated supplies and services without expectation of payment. The tragedy brought out both the best in human nature and revealed the deep bonds that connected the small, rural community. The investigation into Kehoe's background revealed a pattern of violence and instability that had been overlooked or dismissed by those who knew him. His reputation for having a quick temper, his history of violence toward animals, and his increasingly erratic behavior in the months before the massacre were all warning signs that, in retrospect, painted a picture of a man descending into dangerous territory. However, the social norms of the time discouraged interference in others' private affairs, and the concept of threat assessment was unknown. The Bath School massacre would eventually be recognized as a watershed moment in American history, marking the first major act of domestic terrorism specifically targeting a school. However, in 1927, the frameworks for understanding such violence did not exist. The crime was viewed as an aberration, a singular act of madness rather than part of a broader pattern of violence that would unfortunately be repeated in different forms throughout American history. As the community began the slow process of healing, the memory of May 18, 1927, became permanently etched into the collective consciousness of Bath Township. The tragedy would shape the community's identity for generations to come, serving as both a source of profound sorrow and a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. The Bath School Massacre stands as a stark reminder that even in our nation's quietest communities, the seeds of unimaginable horror can take root and flourish in plain sight. As we've journeyed through this dark chapter of American history, we've witnessed how Andrew Kehoe's calculated malevolence transformed a symbol of hope and learning into a scene of devastating tragedy. The events of May 18, 1927, reveal disturbing truths about the capacity for evil that can hide behind facades of respectability and community involvement. Kehoe's methodical planning, his exploitation of trust, and his systematic preparation for mass murder demonstrate how dangerous individuals can weaponize their positions of authority and access. His role as school board treasurer and electrician provided him with both the means and opportunity to carry out his horrific plan, while his outward appearance of civic engagement masked the growing rage and resentment festering within. What makes the Bath School Massacre particularly chilling is not just its scale, but its premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of madness. It was the calculated execution of a plan nearly a year in the making. Kehoe's meticulous wiring of explosives throughout the school, his creation of backup detonation methods, his murder of his wife, and the destruction of his farm all point to a mind that had crossed into territory where human life held no value beyond serving his twisted desire for revenge. The investigation revealed the full scope of Kehoe's preparations. His journals and detailed plans showed a man who had studied every aspect of his intended massacre. This wasn't just an attempt to justify his actions, but a final act of manipulation, trying to shift blame from his choices to his circumstances. The community's response to this tragedy showcases both the best and worst of human nature. While Kehoe's actions revealed the depths of individual evil, the immediate response of neighbors, parents, and rescue workers demonstrated extraordinary courage and compassion. People rushed toward danger to save children, worked tirelessly to dig through rubble, and opened their homes and hearts to those affected. The broader American response, with donations and volunteers arriving from across the nation, showed how tragedy can unite people in common purpose. Yet the psychological scars left by Kehoe's actions proved as lasting as the physical destruction. Survivors carried the trauma for decades, forever changed by their experience of ultimate vulnerability in what should have been a safe space. The Bath community itself struggled with questions that had no satisfying answers. How could they have known? What signs did they miss? How could someone they trusted so completely have harbored such murderous intent? The Bath School Massacre also exposed critical vulnerabilities in how communities protect their most precious members. The ease with which Kehoe gained access to the school, the lack of security measures, and the absence of background considerations for those in positions of trust all highlighted gaps that would eventually lead to modern school security protocols. His case became an early study in what we now recognize as domestic terrorism, demonstrating how ideological grievances and personal resentments can metastasize into attacks on innocent civilians. Perhaps most disturbing is how Kehoe's actions presaged many of the characteristics we see in modern mass violence. His sense of grievance against the community, his methodical planning, his desire to inflict maximum casualties, and his final act of suicide all became patterns that would tragically repeat in American schools and communities in the decades that followed. The Bath School Massacre stands as the horrific prototype for attacks that would become all too familiar in American society. The investigation's conclusion that Kehoe was of rational mind, not insane, remains significant. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that such evil can emerge from seemingly ordinary people operating with clear intent and careful planning. This wasn't madness in any clinical sense, but a conscious choice to pursue the most heinous possible revenge against a community that had simply made democratic decisions Kehoe couldn't accept. The story of Bath also illustrates how quickly public attention can shift, even from the most shocking events. The massacre was pushed from headlines by Charles Lindbergh's historic flight, demonstrating how even the most significant tragedies can be overshadowed by other news. This pattern of initial shock followed by gradual forgetting may explain why the Bath School Massacre, despite being America's deadliest school attack, remains less known than more recent tragedies. The physical memorial that now stands where the school once operated serves as more than just a reminder of those lost. It represents our collective responsibility to remember, to learn, and to remain vigilant against the forces that can turn trusted community members into instruments of terror. The memorial reminds us that behind every statistic were individual children with names, dreams, and families who love them. As we reflect on Andrew Kehoe's crimes, we must resist the temptation to dismiss him as simply a monster or madman. Such labels, while emotionally satisfying, prevent us from grappling with the harder questions his case raises about how communities identify and address potentially dangerous individuals, how we balance trust with security, and how we protect our most vulnerable members without destroying the openness that makes communities thrive. The Bath School Massacre ultimately stands as both a historical tragedy and a continuing warning. It reminds us that the price of safety is eternal vigilance, that evil can wear familiar faces, and that the institutions we trust most deeply can become targets for those who would destroy rather than build. The 45 lives lost on that spring morning in 1927 serve as an eternal reminder that in our commitment to creating safe communities, we must never forget that some among us may harbor the darkest of intentions. Their memory calls us to be better guardians of our children, more thoughtful about whom we trust with access to our most precious institutions, and more vigilant in recognizing the signs of dangerous grievance before it metastasizes into violence. The Bath School Massacre may have been America's first school bombing, but our responsibility is to ensure that through remembrance, vigilance, and action, we do everything in our power to prevent such tragedies from being repeated. The children of Bath Township deserve nothing less than our commitment to learn from their tragedy and to build a world where schools remain sanctuaries of learning rather than targets of terror.